afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Learning from Leaders. Good afternoon, Peter. Good to see you. And first of all, congratulations on the release of your new book.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to yes, exactly, stakeholder capitalism. We'll look forward to that. You tell us a little bit more about that. But I think today everything is about Steve Davis, the Senior Strategic Advisor of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Steve, welcome to Learning from Leaders. Peter, floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Luc, and it's good to be back with all of you as the days are getting a little bit longer already here in Switzerland. And today, actually, I hope it will still be light as we end this session, but it's already light over at the other side of the Atlantic in Seattle. Our guest is Steve Davis. And Steve Davis, as you said, Luc, is the Senior Strategic Advisor of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's also done many other things in his life, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But today we are very happy to welcome him and to talk about his job at the Gates Foundation, his book that came out, Undercurrents. You can see it here, and I recommend everyone to buy and read and review it. And of course, we also have to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for spending time with us. I always typically start by asking our guests, how are you and where are you? I know you're in Seattle, but I see some interesting artifacts behind you in your office. So it looks like you're in China.
Hi, Peter, and hi, Luc, and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me this morning. Yes, I am in Seattle. We are very lucky in a time of COVID to have a place on an island outside of Seattle and then a place in Seattle. So I kind of go back and forth on the ferry between the two. But yeah, and why you see my office is not normally looking this way, but I am currently overseeing the team and strategy for the Gates Foundation in China. So the team had a Chinese New Year celebration and sent me all sorts of things to decorate my Zoom life with. So happy Year of the Ox to everybody.
That's excellent. Thank you for that so much. And of course, there is something to celebrate. I think in China, we're now almost a year after the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out all over the world. Right now, we're still battling that, I think, also in Seattle. Let's talk about the United States. But in China, I think the situation is a lot better, isn't it?
Yeah, China's had an interesting experience over the last year. Obviously, it's the pandemic really took off there and early, and they the team I work with was sent home back in January, but they worked very hard to adopt public health measures, primarily just masking, social distancing, closing down certain activities, and have suppressed the virus very, very well. So by the fall, most of China was back to work, back to business, as was true with the team I oversee. In the last couple weeks, there have been some outbreaks. So there's now some concern that, but when these things happen in China, there's sort of a micro plan. They go literally into communities and neighborhoods and quickly test a lot of people and quickly manage that. So there's a pretty effective response, but we're still watching it and being very careful. But China's back to business. And as you see, it's really one of the only countries in the world that reported a growth, economic growth in 2020.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that, I was going to talk to you about it later, but maybe it's a good moment to bring it up already. One of the things you say in your book, Undercurrents, which we'll talk about, that I found interesting was you quoted, "When the history of the pandemic is written," you said, "I expect that COVID-19 will represent a milestone in digital health." When you speak about that very targeted approach of suppressing the virus in China, does that have anything to do with digital health?
Yeah, so we can talk more about that. And I've been writing more about this, that I think we're already seeing, even though we're not through this pandemic at all, that the amount of digital innovation and digital activity, every aspect, obviously, look at what we're all doing on Zoom, but and education, et cetera, but in health has been phenomenal. But it's also been quite incoherent, and so there's a lot of work to do to figure out how to learn from this and propel us forward. But it's certainly true that in China there's also been a lot of very effective use of digital and data platforms to manage the virus and educate the population, and literally Tencent's WeChat app, which is was put on sort of an open source, so we see some of it in other parts of the world now, is really one of the most powerful in terms of helping people know what's going on in their neighborhood, giving people information about where to go get tested, etc., giving people better advice on how to manage the virus, tracking and tracing, all of that, and these are all on digital platforms. So yeah, there's some real great lessons to learn, I think.
Yeah. Is that the final question on that? Is that because of course we've seen that in other countries too. I have a tracing app on my phone, and it seems to work. I mean, people say that it works, but I personally, maybe luckily, have never gotten a notification of gotten close to anyone that tested for COVID-19. I mean, does that work, and is that a part of the future of digital health? These kinds of tracking and tracing apps?
Well, tracking and tracing apps are useful in a very specific context, in the world of managing an outbreak at the early stages. But of course they need to be adapted for various regulatory and frankly places with different political norms. So some places where privacy, although they're mainly protecting individual privacy pretty well now, but so we're seeing adoption rates around the world varying depending on sort of political will. But I do think it's one of the many things in the toolkit. I would not put it sort of front and center. I think the ability to the thing that I think we are probably not understanding as well is that the ability to do surveillance, but also to really analyze data and track it at the most minute level, has been really quite amazing. Now it's been very clustered and somewhat incoherent, as I was saying, but well, if we can get that right, that would be very effective in a lot of disease management and control for health. But also, we've seen just some interesting innovation around mental health apps, which is really going to propel the mental health field, so people can do more things remotely without and without stigma. We've seen some really amazing work on telemedicine, is we've had to sort of convert a lot of in clinic, in hospital meetings and visits, and that actually has huge application for lower and middle income countries and low resource settings that we focus on, because where there's not easy access to clinics or whatever, or there are not enough health workers. So I think the opportunity for big lessons here is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's something that you actively work on, don't you? And have for many years, because one of the many hats that you wear is that of co-chair of the digital health innovation at the World Health Organization. And so those are the things that, of course, you talk about as well on a regular basis as well with your peers, I suppose, here in Geneva virtually. Now, Steve, I want to go back about, I think it must be almost day to day, a year ago, to a very special moment that must have been your sort of milestone moment in terms of the pandemic in Seattle, as you come back from a trip abroad and you gather a group of business leaders from the Seattle region to talk about this emerging outbreak. And these are business leaders that we might all know. The CEO of Boeing is there, the people, of course, from the Gates Foundation, from Microsoft, Satya Nadella, and so on and so forth. Why did that meeting happen? Why were you there? And what did it mean for managing the pandemic in the Seattle region?
Yeah, it was a unique moment, and I'd sort of correlate it to another one very quickly that sort of was the predecessor moment. I had been appointed to a commission on a U.S. congressional commission on U.S. health security, and it was in order to provide a new administration and Congress recommendations on health security, really coming out of Ebola, and with Republicans and Democrats, congressmen and senators, and a lot of folks. And we had a meeting our final meeting in early February of 2020. It was a very odd meeting because we were in the Senate in one of those big conference Senate hearing rooms with a variety of people, and number of names you would recognize, including Dr. Fauci. But it was but it was the day that the Senate had impeached or had acquitted the first impeachment of Donald Trump. So it was an odd day to be sitting in the Senate and the gloating Republicans and the weary Democrats, etc. But we were sitting there saying, look, there's evidence that this virus in China is going to come and close down businesses in the United States. And it was actually quite shocking to see the absolutely, I mean, across the political spectrum and across this group of experts, how many people were still frankly in denial. It was like, no, this isn't going to happen, we'll contain it, etc. But the evidence was, look, it's already here, and it's going to accelerate, etc. Not to say that we were smarter than anybody else. It was like, but wait a minute, we need to at least have a plan for this. And of course the US failed to ever have a good plan. But 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm back in Seattle as part of a group that I was part of the founding of, which was to say, in the region where we've got some of the biggest and best known companies in the world, as you said, Microsoft and Amazon and Starbucks and Boeing and a variety of others, we pulled together a group of the CEOs, back to your initial book, focused primarily on just CEOs. And I was the CEO of the largest nonprofit at PATH at that time. And we would get together to talk about what we could do regionally to make the region a stronger region, because while it's a very attractive region, we still don't have as good a, relative to a lot of our sort of peers in the world, as a region, we don't have as much, we need to improve our transportation, education, etc. And we were talking about what the topics of 2020 were at this dinner. We have these small dinners every few months. And at that point, I and actually another person who had just come back from DC, who runs one of the biggest health system in the state, said, look, COVID. And it was just, what are you guys talking about? And said, look, I'm worried that I had the date wrong. I said, by the summer, you're going to be closing businesses, and we're going to be, and our health system will be overwhelmed. And there was, again, this sort of jaw-dropping moment, which people just had recognized. The good news, I have to say, and I was very impressed, is, and again, I'm not saying I was prescient, I just happened to have the information that others hadn't had yet, but it does show how ill-equipped we really were to jump on this. But the good news is, in that group, within a week, we had organized ourselves and had actually almost daily stand-up calls to start thinking about what we could do to map out, work with the government on mapping out closures, getting PPE supplies into the state,
Masks,
and even last week, setting up a vaccine command center using private sector. So these various companies, Starbucks and Amazon, et cetera, are working very hard with the state. And so we're doing pretty well, not great, but pretty well on the vaccine rollout, which has also been botched in the United States. But we're doing it reasonably well with that group assisting.
Yeah. And so you had that moment, you had a very rude wake-up call. You maybe a little bit less so than the others there, because of course you work in public health, in global health. And then you say, did it actually help what you say that it did, that those people got together, that they had a group of peers and that they had regular contact with each other? Did that actually help in
Yeah,
fighting the
no, I
pandemic?
think that obviously there's the jury's sort of out still on the whole experience, but I think there's no question. In fact, it was written up on Fortune and some others that first of all, with the help of large business working closer with the government, it was a very good public-private partnership. We lent a lot of resources to the government to start setting up, where they were sort of also managing this without enough resources, so that was very helpful. But also, the evidence would show that we as a state, while we were the first state in the U.S. to have a recorded case, we flattened the curve very quickly. And even today, if you look at the numbers, we as a state, we've done very relatively well. I mean, we've certainly struggled and sadly it had not too many deaths, but relatively well. And many people think, particularly in the western part of the state, many people think that we got on it, we started working, we had very concerted conversations with business leaders about not only what the policies were for closure, what the policies were for reopening, how to get better data to everybody, what that looks like in terms of supporting the government, because we knew this is this really is a government mandate. Getting getting assets. So the head of Microsoft was very good about literally going out and negotiating for PPE. I mean, we did all that.
Yeah, and so it's in a way you could say maybe a vindication of what you've done throughout your career, which is to try and get the best of the public and the private sector together, to work together on development issues and on global health issues, because of course that's a big part of your career, which we'll now talk about. And it's obviously what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is all about. Is the advancement of global public health through targeted investments and public-private cooperation. Steve, I want to shift gears now a little bit and talk a little bit more about your book that you released in the middle of the pandemic. And I want to point this out, just how important this book is. In the middle of the pandemic, a book that came out with a foreword by Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization. I don't know how he found the time to write a foreword at that moment, but it's absolutely amazing. And you talk in your book about your life journey, about your career that has taken you really all over the world and across various sectors, from the technology sector, working with Bill Gates as the CEO of Corbis, a digital imaging company, to McKinsey, Director of Social Innovation, to being a lecturer at Stanford University still today, and of course, the roles that you're in right now. And what I found interesting about this book is you say, I've been driven in my career, and this may be relevant to the students, driven in my career to something I call undercurrents. Could you just very briefly explain what that actually is, an undercurrent, in the context of going on a career journey?
Yeah, sure. And let me step back maybe and help frame the reason I wrote the book and then use the title. I've been noting over the last 3 or 4 years, whether as a lecturer, or teacher, or an activist, or a leader in the global health and development space, or among my friends, this sense of overwhelming sense of things going wrong, kind of discouragement, pessimism or paralysis, maybe, that it just felt like one headline after another. And maybe this was really acute with in the last 4 years in the United States with Donald Trump's tweets, but just one thing after another, creating this sense of, oh my God, this is just like, it feels like we're going from bad to worse, etc. And which I totally understood, but also a sort of sense of, I don't even know what to do about it, like kind of this paralysis. And yet, I also know enough and have experienced enough to know that actually we're making pretty good headway on a lot of things. And if you look at data, if you ignore the headlines and look at the trend lines around many, many issues in the world are pretty good. And so, so how do we shape that narrative differently? And therefore, that's part of the essence of the book. The other is how to think about everybody can be thinking about themselves as an activist rather than you have to be a frontline big name celebrity or something or give away tons of money, that we can all participate in what I call practical activism. So when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, what are some of those currents or things that are, I think, are positive and are forces that are kind of a bit under the water? There's a whole lot of reasons we used water metaphors in the book, going back to my childhood. But what are some things that are happening anyway that we need to kind of ride the wave in order and help propel it, certainly help take advantage of it. It's not passive, it's active, but that are happening already. And in my own life, I've often, when people ask me about my career at students or whatever, and I always like, don't look to me for career advice, because my career looks more like a pinball machine of blah blah blah. But you know, I can describe all these things I've done, but I also think of it more in these big waves or undercurrents that I've seen in my own life, where as a, you know, as an example, you know, getting in very early, it just happened to actually sort of fall into the digital revolution, that being asked to work with Bill Gates early on in the, you know, information superhighway stage of the internet, and writing that, and today, you know, still being very involved in it.
Being a part of history almost, it almost happens, you say, under the current. You don't really realize it perhaps actively in the beginning, but of course that's what we all do. We go with those currents. Now in your case, one of the biggest ones that you've ridden, one of those waves that you've ridden, is of course the advancement of technology, and being or living for many decades now, I suppose years, in Seattle, the home, as you say, of Microsoft and Amazon, two of the biggest tech companies in the world. Now, and you've worked in that sector for many years as the CEO, as I mentioned, of Corbis, a digital imaging company. To what extent is it were you riding the wave of technology, and to what extent were you sort of following or forming a bond with a specific leader in that trend, which in your case was Bill Gates, somebody that you know very well, work with very actively to this day, and have been for many, many years?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the situation, sort of the coincidence of working with Bill probably is unique. But the other, I mean, just briefly, the other three I talk about in the book is my role as a gay activist, and writing, you know, sort of the change in the world over the last 40 years as a gay man, but also engaging as an activist. Also, the work I've done in China, where I was, you know, happened to go there right out of college, and here I am 40 years later, still, you know, engaging and watching that change in the world happen. And so I think to most of it, I would say, is truly identifying sort of waves or themes that are happening and figuring out what you can do to, you know, make them, direct them in the right way, shape them, support them, be part of them. And that was certainly true with technology, which is, you know, in my life. There is no question that along those journeys, the people you meet, you know, influence, and that would be true with, you know, certainly Bill and the work I'm doing in technology and health. But it's also, you know, as I've engaged in, you know, working at McKinsey on, you know, China, innovation in China, and you know, those are linkages that help you propel you to the next stage and the next stage. So I think relationships matter, but I think you also have to decide these trends. The thing I like to say is these trends are really important, and I think there's several really important ones going forward, which is really what the book's about. But you know, they're not inevitable, and they're not equitable, and so we have to keep engaging in them to make them less inevitable. I mean, more inevitable and more equitable.
Yeah. And so, you know, one of the ones that you've been very personally involved in, and you mentioned it already briefly, is the movement on gay rights, the LGBTQ community. Now, when you were growing up, and so you've come out at a certain stage in your life as being, I'm a gay man. At that point, what was it easy for you? And you've said in the book also, which I found interesting, you said, I feel that I never really quite am done with coming out. So could you tell us a little bit more about what that means, and also what this movement, and that you've seen coming from almost being stigmatized to being fully part of society, also legally, at least in many Western countries, how that's been, and how that has been one of those undercurrents?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine this would be true for most members of the LGBTQ community, at least of my generation. Maybe less, maybe not in different, but it is such a it is such a big piece of one's identity. Obviously, it's the people you love. It's how you present yourself in terms of the in many parts of the world. But it's also when I grew up, at least, it was very ugly. I mean, and it was not a pretty picture. In a very conservative community, in a very in a ranching community, etc. And it took a long time to get over the stigma and and also in these communities, the family, it's not the family becomes a really complicated piece of the puzzle. It's not like your family is in the same community, so you necessarily get their support. So I feel like, it has defined me in a lot of ways, not only my sense of activism to help change it. Hopefully it's given me a lot of empathy for people that don't have the other advantages I've had, but it's also one in which, I don't think the work is ever done. And, both on a personal level, as one continues to have to get comfortable in a society that still struggles with this some, and also on a global level. I mean, I feel like we've got to be careful of the narrative that because in Europe and the United States, we've seen gay marriage and some other and more gay politicians and things like that the work is done. In fact, the numbers are very disheartening. How many gay teenagers still commit suicide rates, at how much discrimination exists. And of course, in other parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of gay and lesbian rights go backward, and some really horrific things. So we've just got to keep working on this one. But it's definitely shaped my way of engaging in the world. It's made me uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable times where I was the singular gay leader out open in a community of, certainly, for instance, at that dinner, things like that. I mean, that's a role I'm fairly familiar with. And so but it's changing a lot. And I hope people can find places like that in their life that they can find it. It's actually given me optimism. And that's actually probably a core theme of the book is, in order to channel your outrage to activism, you need to find some optimism along the way. And I think in all of these trends, whether it's been, gay rights or global health and development, I'm very optimistic that we can make change that will stick.
Yeah, because of course you describe a number of positive evolution, long-term trends in the book also on various fields of development. Now, I do get a question from one of the people in the audience, Shayab Ray. I hope I said it correctly. And she asks us about, the rights of minorities and vulnerable groups in times like these, in times of crisis, in times of pandemic. She says, I get the impression that they may be experiencing more of these adverse effects, and that we may in fact see some setbacks in that field. Do you agree with that? And what can you actually do to prevent these setbacks from taking place in times of crisis?
Yeah, and yeah, thank you very much for the question, because one thing I want to underscore very strongly is I'm not a Pollyannish. I wouldn't be doing this work if I thought, oh, everything's going great and it's all just inevitable. I mean, and there's some really super difficult issues that we're struggling with and aren't going so great. I mean, I think maybe some of the longer term trends, if you look historically, are moving in the right direction, but we're still struggling. And that's been exacerbated by COVID for sure. And now the both economic and humanitarian crises that are evolving in its wake. And for sure, we're seeing, I mean, the data is horrifying, both at a global level with, European and American vaccine nationalism affecting the access to vaccines in other parts of the world. And then even in Europe and America, the access to the vaccine, being distributed inequitably despite good intentions, I think. And that's further, so the question is, well, what do we do about it? And that's there's a lot there, but I would say, first and foremost, we got to call it out. I mean, I do think, one of the things that I talk about in the book is in the world of social activism, we've worked forever on equity, but we're actually talking about it and working on it differently now, where it's becoming an absolute core principle around almost any program, any intervention, and so, I would argue that I'm watching it locally where we're having some bad examples of inequitable access to the vaccines. 10, 15 years ago, it wouldn't have made a front page of the paper. And now we're actually following the data. So that doesn't solve the problem, but it's the first step. And then the second is, we've got to be, I'm both, whether it's on gender equity or minority community, or I don't even like, communities, that's actually a funny statement anymore, because in fact, non-white, under a certain age, non-white is a majority in this country, in my country, but we have to, I think I'm a big believer in intentional programmatic interventions around those communities, not assume everything just gets, kind of rolls up. And so I'm a promoter of quotas in certain instances. I believe that we've got to have specific programmatic interventions in the Black community that's different than the Asian community, et cetera, and around some things. It's very tricky because then you can get into sort of racial profiling, et cetera. But the data would say that, things just, there's not a trickle down model that if we get an intervention and it just trickles down to everybody. We have to be quite intentional how communities, with communities, giving them voice and agency to say, how's that going to work in their community or their particular setting?
Yeah, because of course that's one of the trends or the undercurrents, as you say in your book, that you talk about for the future, is that you'll see going forward that you might have communities within countries that require special attention, and also you say we should consider these communities as customers. You really have to work around the idea, even if you work in activism, even if you work in global development, you really have to be oriented towards the needs and listen to these groups, these individual groups, as to what their needs are and how best they can be solved. It's something that you mentioned in the book. Now, and by the way, people agree with you here. I see Angeline Fisher agreeing, representation matters. I also want to ask you a question from Richard Moore, which is about another undercurrent that you've identified as mattering a lot in the future, which is digital disruption. And of course, we've already seen a lot of digital disruption in the past years, and of course in the last year. But we see still this question unresolved, whether digital disruption is a force for good or is a force for bad. And you also talk about that in your book. You say, on the one hand, you've got examples like the Khan Academy, you talk about that, which grew from one teacher online giving classes to 80 million kids getting classes all over the world through this online platform. On the other hand, you've got cases like Maria Ressa, you talk about in your book, from the Philippines, and she says she has a very pessimistic view on this, and she's right to have that, because she's been targeted by online libel cases. She says colonialism never died. She says, it says in your book, it just moved online. In other words, she has a very negative view on the impact of technology overall. And not Roger Moore, but Richard Moore talks about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. He says, you've got a lot of, there's an infodemic. There's a lot of misinformation being spread, and it's harming the public cause on the pandemic. So how do you resolve that sort of undercurrents that both has a positive and negative impact?
Well, for one, I quote your boss in the end of that chapter, actually, Peter, where Klaus Schwab says, I think we've got to get out of this sort of technology is kind of this binary thinking about this technology, and I've lived it for now, early days, and have been riding this wave for a while. And it first of all, to use a bad metaphor, but the train left the station a long time ago. This technology is here. We're going to see it evolve. We're going to see it grow faster. People are addicted to it. We're not going to see the world go back to where a world. So we need to almost get out of this dystopian versus utopian view of technology, and I would argue that, and that's actually not that helpful. Rather than arguing about infodemic as a curse on the world, we have to talk about how do we start shaping our regulatory work, our education, our technology development itself to help start limiting those negative effects in the future. And that would be my overall thesis, and partly, why it seems when we were putting the book together, people said, Steve, it seems like this is a trend that's been going on for a long. Why would you say this is a really important trend? I think in social activism, we're just catching up to how to use technology and data. So I think it does become more important as we think about data and digital for development and global health, and in lower resource communities where we're seeing, starting to see penetration rates of phones, etc. But there's still a lot of they're not being used in the way they are in the rich world.
I thought that was sorry to interrupt you. I heard a quite remarkable quote yesterday that 47% of the global population is still offline.
Yeah, and we forget that as we are so addicted with our multiple. I'm sitting here with 4 phones and 3 laptops, and then the second is that net, and this is sort of the ultimate argument, that this will be a force for good instead of a force for evil. If I don't, on one hand, maybe I'm being almost contradictory to say we shouldn't be going back and forth, and yet I guess my argument is yes, there are. We got to embrace technology I think we have to start embracing it as a positive force for good, but also being steely-eyed in the way we work with it. So, and this is obviously some of the work I'm doing with the WHO, is to say, rather than, how do we actually think about all the levers in our toolkit? It's, community education, it's regulation, it's, customer and consumer incentives. So making, and the technology development itself. I've also in the past taken a view, and I was working on copyright. I was a lecturer in intellectual property law at one point, that also the other piece that I think we have to be smart about is how technology, and we can look across the history of technology over about 150 years, it often can solve some of the very problems it creates. So every single new technology comes with a whole lot of big social problems that come with it. But over time, you start seeing, ways that when, radio was introduced and there was worried about what that would mean for children, well, then there were rules on what could be listened. We've seen it in the world of copyright. Remember when we first started seeing music and other sharing sites, it was all everybody. And now we have very effective filters and takedown tools and all sorts of things. So I'm also quite positive that we'll find our way forward, but it's going to take us a lot of work, and there are going to be some very difficult choices as we come out of this epidemic. I'm a big believer that we need to focus less on product innovation right now and more on policy innovation, that we've got to figure out where and how we create better tools for interoperability. The other thing about the digital piece that I just underscore is, it's, to your point, it's so inequitable. So in COVID, we saw this enormous fire hose of just unbelievable innovation, digital and other, but man, most of it, the best stuff, didn't get to the low resource community that needed it the most in certain parts of the world. And so we've got to figure out access issues as well.
Yeah, and boy, can I talk about that in Switzerland, such a developed country, and we filled in papers when we went to restaurants to let them know who we were. And I heard a comment from a restaurant owner. He said, "I've never had so many famous people come to my restaurant as in the last couple of months. John Travolta, everyone was allegedly all there." I want to move on to some questions from our students. But before I do live questions from our students, before I do, I did want to come back to this one more time, this idea that you have to progress. King Wang, who's a student, online student from China, from Beijing, he asks, what are some of the strategies, most effective strategies that you've seen applied where you're able to convince people that have a traditional mindset into being more open-minded about these progress, about technology, about other things, so that you can advance altogether?
Yeah, it's a great and important question, Ting, and I wish I could give you the magic answer. I guess there's two thoughts. One is I think leaving ego at the door is important, and maybe that's why I talk about practical activism. That I think we put too much spotlight on very big names, big and it's kind of the nature of big celebrities, big philanthropists, and I'm happy they're out there. I work for one, but honestly, most of the world's best activism happens around kitchen tables by people you'll never know. And and it's about doing small things and working to solve simple pieces of problems. And I think we've kind of lost some of that as we've celebrated social entrepreneurs and this innovation, that innovation. And I talk in the book about the slog to get that into the hands of people that need it the most. Takes a lot of accountants and frontline workers and supply chain people. And so finding places to contribute with your own skills, etc., starts helping shape it and move it forward. But I think one of the challenges we have is people coming in and saying this is the solution, he is the person, etc. And so my biggest sort of advice would then be is listening. I just think we spend way too much time talking and way too much time telling others how to solve their problems, as opposed to 80% of the time, if you take the time to listen. I give some examples in the book. You actually you're humbled. B, you realize that people you see as victims or maybe less than because of their social or political situation are actually not that, but have incredible ideas and agency. And 3, that our job is to help them. If you're lucky and working as an activist, our job is limited to just simply, can I help? And if I can't help, then I should get out of the way. And I think listening is important.
Because you also mentioned this was one of the major undercurrents of global development, is you say, we've moved from a world that is sort of a pyramid with a lot of people at the base, a lot of poor people at the base. We have moved to a world that's more like a diamond with a global emerging middle class. And many of those people, and this is an interesting detail, you say they're not pulled out of poverty, they climbed out of poverty. And that's a very important notion, isn't it? That this emerging middle class, that they really do it themselves, and that we should be a little bit more humble, even if you are working in the field of global development and you are working for an NGO and trying the right thing, a little bit more humble in terms of how you look at those people that you want to help.
Yeah, and I would, we could spend the whole day on that, but I in some ways, it's the most important of the 5 trends or undercurrents I talk about, is this changing socio-demographic way we think of the world has so many implications on the way development should work. So, I make the point to saying, where we've spent most of the last 50 years in global health and development architecting it around poor countries, rich countries helping poor countries, we now need to think about it since most of the poorest people, some of the poorest people and most struggling people in the world are living in middle income countries, that we need to talk about, at a community level. But also there's, we're no longer in the post-colonial, well, we are, but post the moment of the late 20th century where there was, post-conflict, post-colonialism, et cetera, where it was really about, there wasn't capacity or institutions or, that's with the exception of some, deeply fragile states that are in enormous conflict. That's just not the case.
No longer the reality.
Yeah.
I want to bring in now one of the students that has joined us today, Vlada Bielik from Odessa in the Ukraine. And she has an interesting question, I think even two. Vlada, why don't you go ahead and ask us a question?
Hello, Mr. Davis. Thank you for joining us today. You have such an impressive career, and I want to ask you, what motivates you the most?
Thanks, Vlada, and nice to see you. And I have to say, I have great memories of spending time in Ukraine, working on TV, and it was a great moment in my life. So I could answer the traditional things. My most highest priority is my family, and that's absolutely true. And finding sort of joy in day-to-day living is a central part of my practice. But I think in my work, I think of impact as a word that comes to the top of mind all the time. Like, how do I make choices so I can have the most effective impact on whatever it is? It doesn't have to be like big name, big time. I'm quite comfortable being behind the scenes and not having any credit around my impact, but I'd like to make sure that I'm using my time to have an impact, whether it's on my family, my community, my writing, whatever. And so that would be the word that would motivate me the most.
Excellent. And, Vlada, I know you had a second question. Could you go ahead and ask that one too? Because I want to link it to some other comments we got from other people.
Yeah, thank you. If you could fix one thing in the world, what would it be?
This is a great question, isn't it, Steve? Because I saw that in your book, somebody asked that exact same question to you. A big businessman asked, if there's one thing I can do to help, what should it be? What should I invest in? What should I put my efforts in?
Yeah. So if I were to, so there's two answers, and ironically, I feel now that I've been saying this for quite a while, and now I think it's become more a conversation. So there are two answers. One is broadly, I think inequity is the biggest challenge facing the world. I think we are, and I say that ironically, given that I believe, I see the data that says we're more of a diamond than a pyramid, etc. But the problem with the diamond is the extremes between the top and the bottom are growing, and so I think broadly inequity. But if I'm asking, so I tell the story in the book of when I was at McKinsey, I used to have to go on what I used to joke about, the newly minted billionaire roadshow, where we'd sit down and talk to heads of state or rich people who were, and they'd always be surprised that they didn't want to talk about lean management or something from the McKinsey point of view, but they were talking about their legacy, what they should be thinking about around their social impact and legacy. So that's why I was brought along. And what I would say is, if it depends on what their passion was or what their capability was or their situation. But if you were to pick one single thing that would change the world the fastest from a sort of programmatic evaluation, it would be educating girls. Educating girls has this enormous spillover effect around, health and financial security, political empowerment, and we're making good progress. Actually, the number of girls being educated in the world is growing quite rapidly, and there are a lot of people working on it. But it has an enormous multiplier effect that we should be all putting our muscle behind.
Yeah, and you give some incredible data also for that in the book. I want to move on to a couple of questions we're getting also from the chat, Steve, because you are really an inspiration, it seems, for many people here. We've got a question from Allison, who's from Vietnam, and she identifies as an Asian queer woman. She says, how do you think that we will actually be able to see progress? Do you think it will be a priority to tackle things like, the discrimination against Asian people, Black Lives Matter, gender equality, homophobia? Are you hopeful that will be a priority now going forward? And then another question from Huyen Mi Pamova from the Czech Republic, who asks, for you personally, how have you dealt with the challenge that you've faced as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and how would you, what would be your advice for people who are trying to deal with that right now in countries where it's not really well supported, like, for example, China?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm hopeful, you know, cautiously optimistic, but hopeful that, as I said, the conversations around equity and inclusion, at least in some organizations and communities, has changed pretty significantly in the last few years. And I'm hopeful that that will continue, but it's not going to be inevitable. We're all going to have to keep, you know, changing the way we think and our mindset around, are we asking the right questions? Are we looking through the lens of, are we looking at the data? Are we disaggregating by gender? Are we disaggregating by communities, et cetera? So I feel like we've got to keep pressing that, but I am hopeful. And even in tough places, I have to say, it's in the book, again, you know, the one of the stories I tell is about a very interesting program I've seen in Vietnam, with you know, gay and a gay community that this is gay men who have organized a set of clinics to address HIV in their community because they were and yet they're also social entrepreneurs. They're solving the problem for their community themselves. It's part of the reason I tell the story. But so you know, I see those kinds of activities around the world, and I think, okay, there really is momentum. I do worry, and yet it's not going to be. First of all, you know, this is a civil rights broadly, and this is where I think maybe having done this kind of activism and being trained as a civil rights lawyer or a human rights lawyer, this is a, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or 2 steps backward, 1 step forward kind of process. Look at what's going on in Russia today or other parts of the world. You can only. And so I think we have to make sure that people understand this isn't inevitable, and it's a very tough journey. But the second is, I actually am worried that I know there's a lot of hopefulness, and WEF, Peter Works and others are quite hopeful that we can use this, you know, this moment in history, this sort of terrific moment, complicated moment coming out of this pandemic, as a moment of reset. And I would love that to be true, and I'm working on it on a number of fronts. I actually do get worried that we're going to be so anxious to get economies back to work, and, you know, that we actually could go the other way, that we're going to sort of, you know, say it's so important to get people back to work and to get, you know, businesses working again and get schools open, et cetera, that we're going to, we actually could, we've seen some evidence that we're going to go backwards on labor rights and go backwards on, you know, equity issues, or go backwards on environmental protection. And so,
and not only that, right? Because also, you know, we've seen it now in terms of protectionism, nationalism, and so on and so forth. And on that regard, I think Stefano Tracchillo from Italy, who's with us, who studies in Barcelona, has a question about that too. Stefano, if you could join us.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much, Steve. It's really nice having you here today. Like, you gave us some brilliant insight, and you're really like a truly inspiration. So my question is, the world is evolving incredibly quickly. We're still in the middle of the global pandemic, and the effect of global warming like increasingly evident. Despite these geopolitical forces that do not appear to be like fully cooperating, we see like trade war be like against China and US, and with another on the common, like they're not working together on the common good of the mankind. So how will these factors affect social innovation and sustainability in the short and long term?
That's a big one. It's a hard one to answer. So you win the award for the tough question. So look, we are in a moment of incredible disruption globally. And I think a lot of things are being challenged, but I do think there are these threads that will help pull us forward despite the challenge. I mean, climate is by far our biggest, you know, existential crisis. I think inequity is another existential crisis if we don't get it under control, and they're interrelated because climate will exacerbate inequality. I still believe there's, you know, 4 or 5 key tools in the toolkit that will, you know, one will be, we have to, community movements are still possible to get people to change their mindsets and their behaviors, and think about, and it's hard with climate, but we're seeing some evidence that people are beginning to change their behavior, etc. There are policy tools, and we've got to use government smartly to do policy tools, both globally and nationally and locally. And we see more and more evidence that will happen. There are innovation opportunities, and I'm obviously, that's where I spend a lot of my time on social innovation, and there will be technologies, there will be better processes, etc., that will help us. And then there's I think there's sort of community and public education and activism. So, where you kind of motivate people to engage in a new way. So I'm still quite optimistic that we will find the moment for those things to come together. Now, there's no question, I think the clock is ticking on climate particularly. And so we've got to, and so I'm hopeful that now with I think with the Trump administration gone, maybe there's a moment where the global conversation from the two biggest emitters, the U.S. and China, will now be able to be re-engaged. Bill, my boss and friend, is publishing a book next week, or I think
how to avoid a climate disaster. I think.
Yeah. So there's people coming to the table to say, okay, but this is a big one. And if I worry about my son's generation, that how they're gonna, he's your age, that's gonna be tackling this. But I still feel like we've just kind of got to break it down to its parts, figure out the pieces. This is the practical activist. Let's not get overwhelmed. Let's not just be outraged, but let's break it down into its parts, figure out what piece of the puzzle you can work with given your interest or expertise, and let's go solve it, just like we've solved these other big problems in the past.
Yeah, that's indeed very optimistic. And I want also perhaps to end our conversation, bring in Gaia Romanelli, who's also from Italy and who's also in Barcelona, and I think even in the same class as Stefano. Gaia, what was your question? I thought it was very adequate also.
First of all, nice to meet you and congratulations for all of your achievements. Gotta say that your career is pretty impressive. And I was wondering, as a senior strategic advisor at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, what has been, if you can pinpoint it, your hardest challenge, and what were the tools and the approach you used to overcome it?
Well, I think the hardest, any given day I can probably list 8. And first of all, thank you, and thank you for your kind words. I would go back to the earlier comment I made about listening. I think the biggest challenge, the big foundations, big NGOs, social activists, particularly, academics, is we think we have the answer. And we are not, and we're pretty arrogant about the answer, and the foundation is particularly can be that way. And that's not to say that one doesn't have to have some sort of verve and boldness to take on some of these challenges. I think there is a level to which you've got to have a fairly confident sort of set of, we can't waffle, or otherwise we don't get anything done. But I think we still simply fail to listen as well. So I think one of my biggest challenges at the Gates Foundation in this role has been, I want to spend more time trying to figure out what the world is asking for China to do, and what China wants, different institutions and partners in China want to do, and how that fits into what the Gates Foundation is thinking about, rather than just what the Gates Foundation wants to do. And so it's listening, and it gets back to the customer idea, listening to people in the world who actually would like our help or need our help, and finding out better from them what they want, rather than us telling them what we think they need. And I think that's a big challenge in the development community writ large, and the foundation has that challenge.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people appreciate that you have that perspective, Steve. For example, Angeline Fisher, she also mentioned that it's humbling, she says, to acknowledge that we all have blind spot, and she hopes that maybe a final question then that she asks: how can we learn and teach greater empathy? How do you do that?
Yeah, and empathy has its role, and it also can be, has its limitations. I mean, if you're so empathetic that you can only understand the other person's point of view, you may not be equipped to, you know, make hard decisions, or, you know, so I think you have to be careful that empathy isn't in and of itself. It's something that, you know, but I think, you know, there's some things I think programs like you guys are in, where you're actually engaging across cultures and across communities, and thinking about it is part of the process to understand that they're truly different points of view. I think, you know, we've talked about vaccine misinformation, infodemics, the craziness of sort of the populist movement in the United States and other places, and I think listening is part of the and empathy and listening is part of the problem. Is we're actually not listening to those voices well enough and understanding what's really driving and motivating them. So I think, first of all, putting yourself in a position of being kind of forced to have those conversations. Second of all, you know, as somebody said the other day, I heard an interview from Larry King and his obituary saying, "I never learned anything while I was talking." And, you know, that's a good thing to sort of keep in mind, that as you're having those conversations. And then the third is, I think being very practical. I feel that this is, again, maybe just my book, but I feel like we get too caught up in the big gestures or the big moments, and not understanding that most change in the world's happened with little gestures and little ideas and practical steps. And so, you know, if it's just one moment that you can go and spend some time in a community that looks and feels quite different than your own, or you push yourself out of your comfort level, that will help you think about empathy in a new way.
Yeah, it's a fantastic way. I think also a hopeful message to conclude our conversation. Steve, there were so many questions we couldn't get to. I want to acknowledge everyone who put in the comments: Mitilian, Eve, Mandy, Stanislav, Edward, Daniele, Richard. The list goes on and on. Many unanswered questions still, but I think we learned an awful lot in the hour that we get to spend with you. And I'd like to thank you, of course, but also want to recommend one final time your book, Undercurrents. If people want to know more about your perspectives, they can find a lot of information in that book, Undercurrents. I think it's a great way to thank you if we all went to look it up online, buy it on Amazon or anywhere else that books are sold, I think. But for now, Steve, thank you so much for spending the time with us. And I wish you all the best for the day and the period ahead. And then back over to Luc.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Peter. It has been a nice hour spent. I think it was fabulous that you were able to answer some of the questions of our students. Some might have been more challenging than others, but we highly appreciate your time. I highly recommend your book, and recommend all of our viewers to definitely go on Amazon, buy it, because there is a lot of learnings and some great stories that you can learn from in there. I'd also like to take advantage and stress on the inclusion of different activities that we'll be doing at EU Business School. As of we will be celebrating the Women in Business in March, and we'll be celebrating the achievements of the female community at EU Business School, alumni, the faculty members, all the different stakeholders that are involved. So we will have different activities in this regard, and feel that we will be participating at our scale to the inclusion in this regard. Last but not least, Learning from Leaders continues. The series continues, and it's already next week. And we will have we will be welcoming José Manuel Barroso, the chair at Gavi, former Prime Minister of Portugal, former President of the European Commission. It's Friday, February 12th, 4 p.m. In the meantime, everybody stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve.